July 18, 1944. 400 American soldiers are about to die in a French town you've never heard of. One man will save them all, then spend 40 years wishing he hadn't. Picture this. You're in the middle of one of World War II's most brutal battles. Bombs are exploding all around you, your buddies are falling one by one, and it looks like there's no way out. Suddenly, an ordinary soldier, someone you barely knew, does something so incredible that he saves not just your life, but the lives of hundreds of other men. Now imagine that after this heroic act, this same soldier just disappears. Not physically, but from history. His name never shows up in books. No medals, no recognition, nothing. It's like he never existed. This is the true story of James Michael Mickey O'Brien, a 23-year-old Irish-American soldier who, in one impossible night of courage, changed the course of an entire battle in Normandy and then spent the rest of his life in complete silence about what he did. Why would a war hero choose to disappear from his own story? Why would someone who should have statues built in his honor prefer to die unknown? The answer will shock you. It was July 18, 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. The world was celebrating the Normandy beaches as a success, but the reality on the battlefield was very different. Allied forces were trapped in urban combat hell in small French towns, facing German resistance much fiercer than anyone had predicted. The 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment was surrounded in the town of Saint-Vith. It wasn't a town you'd find in history books, just a few cobblestone streets, centuries-old stone houses, and a Gothic church in the center. But for the 847 men trapped there, Saint-Vith became the most important place in the world. I discovered this story by accident while investigating declassified military files at the Library of Congress. I was looking for something completely different when I found a military report with just 2 pages, filed incorrectly among medical supply documents. The header read, "Extraordinary Action, Private Jim O'Brien, Classified." Why would a report about an ordinary soldier be classified for over 70 years? It didn't make sense. It took me months to piece together this story, talking to veterans, searching through archives in 3 different countries, and tracking down family members who never knew the whole truth about what happened that night in Saint-Vith. James Michael O'Brien wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to find in the pages of history. Born in the Bronx in 1921 to Irish immigrant parents, he worked as a mechanic in a garage before being drafted into the army. His platoon buddies described him as quiet, reliable, someone who always did his job without complaining, but never stood out. Mickey was the kind of guy you barely noticed. 98-year-old Robert Walsh, one of the last surviving veterans of that battalion, told me. He wasn't the tallest, wasn't the strongest, wasn't the smartest. But there was something about him, a steadiness. You knew you could count on Mickey. On the afternoon of July 17th, the battalion had moved into Saint-Vith following orders to occupy and hold the town at any cost. Military intelligence had indicated that German resistance would be minimal, just a few snipers and maybe a small reconnaissance unit. They were completely wrong. When the sun started to set, it became clear that Saint-Vith was a trap. The 12th SS Panzer Division had arrived first and turned every house, every street, every corner of the town into a fortress. The Americans weren't facing isolated snipers. They were walking straight into the heart of one of the German army's most brutal elite units. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at 7:47 p.m. Private Tommy Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who carried the company radio, was trying to establish communication with command when his head just exploded. 1 second he was talking to me about his sister back home, Walsh remembered, his hands still shaking slightly even after all these years. The next second, I was covered in his blood. We didn't even hear the shot. It was a German sniper, positioned in the church bell tower. Within minutes, more precise shots started coming from all directions. The American battalion realized they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the battalion commander, tried to organize an orderly retreat, but it was already too late. German forces had sealed off all exits from the town. Mortar explosions began raining down on American positions. What should have been a routine operation turned into a survival nightmare. By 11:15 p.m., the situation was desperate. Of the battalion's 4 companies, 2 had been completely wiped out. Alpha Company was reduced to 23 men from its original 180. Bravo Company had lost all its officers. The command post had been hit by a direct mortar, killing Colonel Thompson and his support team. Mickey O'Brien was with the survivors of Charlie Company, holed up in the basement of a destroyed bakery 2 blocks from the main square. With him were 31 other men, including his best friend, Danny Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican from Harlem who dreamed of becoming a teacher when the war ended. It was when Danny got hit that everything changed. Danny Rodriguez was hit in the chest by grenade shrapnel at 2:30 a.m. The impact threw him against the stone wall of the basement, and it was immediately clear that his lungs were punctured. Every breath was a desperate struggle, and foamy blood came out of his mouth. He was dying right in front of me, Walsh told me, who was in that same basement that night. Danny was trying to talk, trying to tell us something, but only blood came out. And Mickey went crazy. What happened next defies all military or human logic. Mickey O'Brien, the quiet mechanic from the Bronx who had never stood out in anything, made a decision that no one else would have had the courage to make. He looked at the 30 wounded and terrified men around him, then at Danny agonizing, and then at the stairs leading to the chaos of battle outside. "You guys stay here," he said, checking his ammunition. "I'm going to get help." "Mickey, that's suicide," protested Sergeant Williams, the highest-ranking officer left. "There are Germans everywhere out there. You won't last 5 minutes." Mickey just smiled, a sad smile that Walsh never forgot. Danny doesn't have 5 minutes, and then he disappeared into the darkness. What Mickey O'Brien did in the next 4 hours defies all military logic. Using only his intuition, basic knowledge of Saint-Vith's streets, and courage nobody knew he possessed, he began an impossible mission: cross a city controlled by enemy forces to reach American lines and organize a rescue. First, he needed to get out of the city without being detected. Saint-Vith was crawling with German patrols, snipers positioned at strategic points, and explosive traps on practically every street. Any movement in the darkness would result in instant death. Mickey knew cars. He had spent years working with engines, understanding how machines worked. This seemingly irrelevant experience would become his salvation. Behind the bakery was a damaged German Kübelwagen, a light military vehicle that had been abandoned after hitting a mine. The engine still worked, but the steering system was severely damaged. For anyone normal, it was a useless piece of junk. Mickey worked in the dark for 45 minutes, using only his hands and some improvised tools to repair enough of the steering system to make the vehicle barely controllable. Then, in an act of genius or complete madness, he decided to pose as a wounded German soldier returning to the lines. He took the uniform off a dead German soldier, covered his face with blood and dirt to look wounded, and began driving slowly through Saint-Vith's streets, groaning in German whenever he passed patrols. It worked, not just once but 5 times. 5 different German patrols let him pass, assuming he was one of their own wounded soldiers trying to get back to German lines for medical treatment. At 4:15 a.m., Mickey finally reached American lines, 12 kilometers from Saint-Vith. But his battle was just beginning. The first challenge was convincing American soldiers that he wasn't a German spy. Wearing an enemy uniform, driving a German vehicle, and talking about a battle that officially shouldn't be happening, Mickey looked exactly like an infiltrating agent. It took 35 precious minutes to convince Major George Patterson, the outpost commander, that his story was true. Finally, when Mickey recited from memory the names, ages, and hometowns of all 31 men trapped in the bakery basement, Patterson believed him. But then came the second challenge: convincing superior officers to authorize a rescue mission. "You're telling me an entire battalion is trapped in Saint-Vith, and you're the only one who managed to escape?" questioned Colonel James Mitchell, who had taken command after Thompson's death. "And you want me to send more men into an obvious trap?" Mickey didn't have time for diplomacy. Danny was dying, and every minute lost meant more deaths in the bakery basement. "Sir," he said, looking directly into the colonel's eyes, "I crossed 12 kilometers of enemy territory to get here. It wasn't to make a report, it was to save my buddies. If you won't send help, I'm going back alone." There was something in Mickey's voice, an absolute determination that impressed even the most skeptical officers. Colonel Mitchell authorized a limited rescue operation: 2 Sherman tanks, an infantry company, and an emergency medical unit. What happened next would become one of the war's most successful rescue operations, but also one of the most forgotten. Mickey guided the rescue force back to Saint-Vith, using his newly acquired knowledge of German positions to avoid the main defenses. At 6:45 a.m., they reached the bakery. Danny Rodriguez was still alive, but barely. The 31 men in the basement were in various conditions, some seriously wounded, others just traumatized by the previous night's terror. But all alive. The evacuation should have been simple: load the wounded into vehicles and get out of the city quickly. But when the American tanks started moving, something unexpected happened. American soldiers started appearing from everywhere. There were far more survivors in Saint-Vith than anyone had imagined. Small groups of soldiers had been hiding in basements, attics, and ruins throughout the city, waiting for an escape opportunity. When they saw the Sherman tanks, they ran to join the evacuation. In 20 minutes, the simple rescue operation turned into a mass evacuation. More than 400 wounded and scattered American soldiers converged on the tanks, all desperate to escape the Saint-Vith nightmare. But there was a problem: there wasn't enough room in the vehicles for everyone. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding the rescue operation, faced a terrible choice. He could take the original 31 men and some of the most seriously wounded, leaving hundreds behind, or he could attempt a complete evacuation that would probably result in the destruction of the entire rescue force. That's when Mickey O'Brien made his second heroic decision of the night. "Captain," he said, "I know every German position in this city. If we give them 20 minutes to reposition, we can create an escape route for everyone." Hayes looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Soldier, are you suggesting we attack fortified German positions with 2 tanks and 60 men?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting I attack the German positions while you evacuate everyone else." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone understood what Mickey was proposing: a suicide mission to distract German forces long enough for hundreds of other men to escape. "That's madness," Hayes said. "It's necessary," Mickey replied. Mickey O'Brien grabbed a Bar automatic rifle, all the grenades he could carry, and disappeared into Saint-Vith's streets for the second time that night. For the next 25 minutes, he waged a personal war against the 12th SS Panzer Division. Alone, he attacked 3 different machine gun positions, destroyed 2 observation posts, and created so much chaos that German forces assumed they were being attacked by a much larger unit. While Mickey kept the Germans busy, Hayes managed to evacuate all 400-plus American soldiers from Saint-Vith. Every truck, every tank, every available vehicle was used to transport the wounded and exhausted to safety. At 8:30 a.m., the evacuation was complete. All American soldiers had escaped from Saint-Vith. All except one. Mickey O'Brien survived his impossible mission. 3 hours after the last evacuation vehicles left Saint-Vith, he emerged from the city ruins, wounded but alive. He had been hit by shrapnel in 3 different places, his uniform was in tatters, and he could barely walk, but he was alive. Any normal person would have been received as a hero. Mickey had saved over 400 lives with his actions. He should have received the Medal of Honor, military parades, newspaper interviews. His story should have been in every World War II book. But when Mickey finally reached the field hospital where his rescued comrades were being treated, he made a bizarre request to Captain Hayes. "Sir, I want this mission to remain classified." Hayes didn't understand. "Soldier, you just performed one of the most heroic actions I've ever witnessed. Why do you want to keep this secret?" Mickey's answer would change everything, because Danny Rodriguez died while I was out there. Danny Rodriguez had died at 7:15 a.m., shortly after the evacuation began. He had held on for more than 5 hours after being wounded, waiting for Mickey to return. His last words, according to Walsh, were, "Did Mickey come back? Is he okay?" When Mickey learned of Danny's death, something broke inside him. The man who had risked everything to save hundreds of lives couldn't forgive himself for not saving the one life that really mattered to him. Mickey blamed himself, explained Dr. Patricia O'Brien Martinez, Mickey's niece who only learned the complete story after he died in 1987. He believed that if he had stayed in the basement, he could have kept Danny alive for a few more minutes. That his search for help had been useless. It was completely irrational logic. Mickey had saved over 400 men. His action had been one of the war's most successful rescues. But for him, all of that meant nothing compared to his best friend's death. He asked Captain Hayes to classify the mission report and never talk about what happened in Saint-Vith again. Hayes, respecting the wishes of the man who had risked everything, agreed. Mickey O'Brien returned to combat 2 weeks later, as soon as his wounds healed. He participated in 12 more combat engagements before the war ended, always doing his job without complaining, never standing out. His comrades knew something had happened in Saint-Vith. They had been rescued, after all, but Mickey never talked about it. After the war, Mickey returned to the Bronx and resumed his work as a mechanic. He married Margaret Kelly in 1947, had 3 children, and lived an apparently normal and happy life. He worked 6 days a week, went to church on Sundays, coached the neighborhood Little League baseball team. But he never talked about the war. Not a word. His daughter Susan O'Brien Walker, 78 years old, told me. We grew up knowing Dad had fought in Europe, but he never told any stories. When we asked, he just said he preferred not to think about the past. Margaret, his wife of 40 years, tried a few times over the years to find out what had happened during the war. She knew Mickey had nightmares regularly, that he woke up screaming a name, Danny, but he never explained who Danny was or why he haunted him. Mickey's silence wasn't just about modesty or war trauma. It was about guilt. In the files I found, there were unsent letters Mickey had written to Danny Rodriguez's family. Pages and pages of apologies, explanations, attempts to make them understand why he had failed to save their son. One letter, dated 1952, 7 years after the war ended, read, "Dear Mrs. Rodriguez, I know I have no right to write to you after all these years. I was Danny's best friend in the war, and I let him down when he needed me most. I should have stayed with him. I should have found a way to save him. Every day I think about what I could have done differently. Every day I wish it had been me instead of him. Your son was a better man than I'll ever be, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to bring him home to you." Mickey never sent these letters. He kept them in a shoebox in the attic, along with the Bronze Star he received, a much smaller honor than he deserved, some more photographs, and the Rodriguez family's address in Harlem. It was only in 1985, 2 years before he died, that Mickey finally decided to tell the truth to someone. But it wasn't to his family, it was to a complete stranger. Father Michael Santos was a young Catholic priest who had started working in Mickey's parish. During a routine confession, Mickey suddenly began talking about Saint-Vith. For 2 hours, he told the whole story: the rescue, the lives saved, Danny's death, the guilt he had carried for 40 years. He cried like a child. Father Santos, now 85 and retired, told me. This strong man, who had worked with his hands his whole life, completely broke down. He said he had carried this secret for so long it was killing him inside. Father Santos did something no military officer or therapist had managed to do. He convinced Mickey that he wasn't a failure, but a hero. That saving 400 lives wasn't invalidated by being unable to save one. That Danny would have been proud of what his friend had done. But it was too late for Mickey to change his perspective about himself. Guilt had become part of his identity, and he had lived with it for so long he couldn't imagine who he would be without it. Mickey O'Brien died on September 23, 1987, of a heart attack while working in his garage. He was 66 years old. His funeral was small, family, some neighborhood friends, work colleagues. Nobody mentioned Saint-Vith or the 400 men who owed their lives to him. It was only after his death, when his family was cleaning out his belongings, that they discovered the shoebox in the attic. The unsent letters, the war photographs, the Bronze Star he had never mentioned. Susan O'Brien Walker showed me these letters when I visited her in her Queens apartment. "I couldn't believe it," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she held the yellowed pages. My father, the quiet mechanic who barely talked about his work, had been a war hero who saved hundreds of lives. But even after discovering the truth, Mickey's family respected his wishes. They didn't seek publicity, didn't contact newspapers, didn't try to get his story known. Mickey had chosen silence, and they honored that choice. It took me 2 years to track down the still living survivors of the Saint-Vith operation. Of the more than 400 men Mickey helped save, only 12 were still alive when I began my research in 2019. Now, only 7 remain. Robert Walsh, who told me the initial story, kept Mickey's secret for more than 70 years. "Mickey made us promise we'd never talk about what he did," he told me. He said he didn't want to be remembered as a hero when he had failed to save his best friend. But Walsh, at 98 years old, finally decided to break his silence. "I'm dying," he said simply, And before I go, I want the world to know that Mickey O'Brien was the bravest man I ever met. He saved my life, and the lives of hundreds of other men. He deserves to be remembered. Thomas Chin, no relation to Tommy Chin, who was killed by the sniper, a 96-year-old survivor from Alpha Company, told me, "We all knew something special had happened. Suddenly American tanks appeared out of nowhere and got us out of there. But Mickey never wanted credit. He just said he was doing his job." One of the most moving parts of this investigation was trying to find Danny Rodriguez's family. Mickey had carried the guilt of Danny's death for 40 years, but had never contacted the family to explain what happened. Through military and genealogical records, I managed to locate Danny's sister, Maria Rodriguez Gonzalez, now 89 years old and living in San Antonio, Texas. When I called her and explained why I was contacting her, the silence on the line lasted almost a full minute. "Danny had a friend named Mickey," she finally said, her voice breaking. "He wrote letters about this Mickey all the time. Said Mickey was the most decent man he'd met in the army. That if anything happened to him, Mickey would take care of him." Maria never knew the details of how Danny died, only that he had been killed in action in France. When I told her about Mickey, how he had risked everything to try to save Danny, how he had carried the guilt of her brother's death for decades, she cried. "That foolish man," she said through tears. "Danny would have been so angry at him for blaming himself. My brother died surrounded by friends who cared about him. How many soldiers can say that? Mickey gave Danny something no medicine could give, hope until the end." Mickey O'Brien's story raises a deep question about the nature of heroism and how we deal with trauma and guilt. Why would someone who saved hundreds of lives choose to live in anonymity? Why does society celebrate some heroes while others remain completely unknown? Dr. James Patterson, no relation to Major Patterson in the story, a war trauma specialist at Columbia University, explained to me that Mickey's reaction isn't uncommon. Many veterans who performed heroic actions also experienced traumatic losses, he said. For them, being called a hero feels like a betrayal of those they couldn't save. Mickey O'Brien suffered from what we call amplified survivor's guilt, Dr. Patterson continued. He didn't just survive when others died, he was instrumentally responsible for saving others while failing to save the person who mattered most to him. This cognitive dissonance can be devastating. By living his entire life in silence about his actions in Saint-Vith, Mickey lost more than public recognition. He lost the opportunity to properly process his trauma, to receive support from other veterans who would understand his experience, to find meaning in his heroic actions. His daughter Susan told me, "Sometimes I wonder if Dad would have been happier if he had talked about the war. He always seemed to carry a weight, you know? Like he was keeping something very heavy inside him." Margaret, his wife, had died in 1985, 2 years before Mickey, without ever fully knowing what her husband had been through during the war. "She always knew there was something," Susan told me. "Mom used to say Dad had sad eyes, even when he was smiling." Mickey O'Brien's story forces us to reconsider our definitions of heroism. We're used to heroes who seek recognition, who tell their stories, who let the world know about their brave actions. Mickey represents something different, pure heroism, without expectation of reward or recognition. But his silence also represents a tragedy. How many other stories like Mickey's exist? How many other anonymous heroes lived and died without their extraordinary actions being known? American World War II military archives contain millions of classified or incorrectly filed documents. Mickey's story was only discovered by accident. How many others are waiting to be found? The 400-plus people Mickey helped save in Saint-Vith went home, got married, had children, built lives. Their families grew, their businesses prospered, their communities benefited from their contributions. The impact of a single night of courage spread through entire generations. Robert Walsh had 5 children and 14 grandchildren. He became a history teacher after the war and spent decades educating young people about the horrors and heroisms of World War II, though he never spoke specifically about Mickey until recently. Thomas Chin opened a small import business that employed more than 50 people. He was one of the first Chinese-American entrepreneurs to achieve significant success in the post-war period, opening doors for other immigrants. Each survivor lived a full life that wouldn't have been possible without Mickey O'Brien's actions. But Mickey never knew this. He died believing he had failed. Mickey O'Brien's story teaches us something profound about the nature of sacrifice and true heroism. In an age where every action is documented, shared, and celebrated on social media, Mickey represents a form of courage that barely exists anymore, doing what's right simply because it's right, without expectation of recognition. But his story also reveals the dangers of silence. Mickey carried alone a burden that could have been lightened if he had allowed others to help him process his experience. His refusal to accept that he had done something extraordinary deprived him of the healing that comes with recognition and gratitude. Father Santos, the priest who heard Mickey's confession, told me something I'll never forget. Mickey spent 40 years punishing himself for not being able to do the impossible, keep Danny alive while saving 400 other people. He never understood that God didn't expect more from him than any human being could give. During my research, I made a discovery that Mickey never knew, and that would have completely changed his perspective on that night in Saint-Vith. In the field hospital medical records, I found the report of the doctor who treated Danny Rodriguez. Dr. William Morrison, the surgeon who examined Danny when he arrived at the hospital, wrote, "Private Rodriguez suffered wounds that were 100% fatal. Both lungs were punctured in multiple places, and there was extensive heart damage. It's medically impossible that he survived more than 15 to 20 minutes after the initial injury." Danny Rodriguez had lived more than 5 hours after being wounded. Medically, this was impossible. The only explanation was pure willpower. He was keeping himself alive, waiting for Mickey to come back. Dr. Morrison added a personal note to the file. "I've never seen anything like it. This soldier should have died instantly, but remained conscious and talking for hours. He kept asking for someone named Mickey. His last act was to hold a buddy's hand and whisper, 'Tell Mickey he's a good man.' Mickey never knew Danny's final words. If he had, maybe he would have understood that he hadn't failed his friend. He had given him enough hope to stay alive until the end." In 1994, surviving veterans of Saint-Vith tried to organize a memorial ceremony to mark the 50th anniversary of the operation. They wanted to honor Mickey O'Brien posthumously, finally giving him the recognition he deserved. Susan O'Brien Walker was contacted by the Veterans Organization, but she refused to allow her father's name to be used. "Dad chose anonymity," she said. "Even in death, I want to respect his wishes." It was an understandable but tragic decision. The memorial never happened, and another opportunity to honor Mickey was lost. Today, there's a small monument in Saint-Vith commemorating the battle, but it doesn't mention specific names. Tourists walk past it every day, with no idea they're walking through the same town where a Bronx mechanic once saved hundreds of lives. There's one last mystery in Mickey O'Brien's story that I never could completely solve. In the military archives, I found a Medal of Honor recommendation dated August 1944, signed by Colonel James Mitchell. The document described Mickey's actions in Saint-Vith in detail and recommended America's highest military decoration. But the recommendation was never processed. Someone had crossed out Mickey's name from the document and written, "Withdrawn at soldier's request," in the margin. Mickey didn't just refuse recognition, he actively sabotaged his own decoration processes. He wanted to ensure he would never be forced to accept honors he felt he didn't deserve. This final discovery made me realize something about Mickey I had missed before. His silence wasn't just about guilt or modesty, it was about a life philosophy. Mickey genuinely believed that doing what was right didn't deserve special recognition. For him, saving lives in danger was simply what any decent person would do. In 2020, I managed to organize something Mickey never allowed in life, a meeting between his family and the Saint-Vith survivors. Susan O'Brien Walker traveled to Buffalo to meet Robert Walsh. It was an emotional encounter that lasted 3 hours, with Walsh telling stories about Mickey that his own daughter had never heard. "Your father saved my life," Walsh said, holding Susan's hands. "Not just physically, he gave me 75 extra years with my family. My children exist because Mickey O'Brien was brave. My grandchildren exist because your father didn't give up on us." Susan cried when Walsh showed a photograph he had kept for 76 years, Mickey and Danny Rodriguez sitting together outside a tent in England, a few weeks before they left for Normandy. It was the first photo of her father as a young soldier she had ever seen. "He looks so young," she said. "So hopeful." "He was," Walsh replied. "We all were. We believed we'd make a difference in the world. And your father really did." Today, 7 decades after Saint-Vith, Mickey O'Brien's true legacy is finally becoming clear. It's not just about the 400-plus lives he directly saved, but about the concept of silent heroism he represents. In an era of constant self-promotion, where every good deed is documented and shared, Mickey reminds us that the purest heroism might be the kind nobody ever knew happened. He challenges us to reconsider why we do good things. Is it for recognition or simply because they're right? Dr. Patricia O'Brien Martinez, who became a doctor specializing in war trauma after discovering her uncle's story, told me, "Mickey taught me that you can carry pain and still choose to do good. That your wounds don't define your actions. Every day, I treat veterans struggling with survivor's guilt, and I tell them about my uncle, the man who saved hundreds of lives and never could forgive himself for not saving one." In September 2023, 36 years after Mickey's death, his family finally made a decision. Susan O'Brien Walker, now 79 years old and knowing she might be one of the last people alive to remember Mickey personally, decided to break the silence her father had requested. "Dad wanted to protect his memory from the shame he felt," she said. "But now I see that by hiding his story, we were depriving the world of an example of true courage. Maybe it's time to let people know that real heroes exist. They just don't always wear capes or want to be called heroes." The O'Brien family decided to donate Mickey's war belongings to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The unsent letters to the Rodriguez family, the bronze star he never mentioned, and photographs of his dead comrades will be displayed for the first time. Most importantly, they authorized this story to be told. After decades of silence, Mickey O'Brien will finally receive the recognition he always deserved, not because he sought it, but because the world needs to know people like him exist. Mickey O'Brien's story is more than just another forgotten war tale. It's a window into a different time, when character was defined not by what you said about yourself, but by what you did when nobody was watching. Mickey lived among us for 42 years after the war, fixing cars, coaching Little League baseball teams, going to Mass on Sundays. His neighbors in the Bronx never knew they were living next to a man who had risked everything to save hundreds of lives. To them, he was just Mickey, the quiet mechanic who always did good work and never charged too much. But maybe that's the most powerful lesson of his story. True heroes don't wear special uniforms or have superpowers. They're ordinary people who, when faced with impossible choices, do the right thing even when it costs them everything. Robert Walsh, the last known survivor who can still talk about that night in Saint-Vith, told me something the last time we spoke. Mickey always said he hadn't done anything special. That anyone would have done the same thing. But he was wrong. Anyone could have done what he did, but only he actually did it. Today, when I look at the yellowed photographs of Mickey O'Brien, the young soldier with hopeful eyes, the middle-aged mechanic with calloused hands, the elderly grandfather smiling at his grandchildren, I see something our society has lost and desperately needs to find again. I see proof that ordinary heroes exist, that extraordinary acts of courage happen every day, that some of history's most important people never had their names in books. And I see a reminder that doing the right thing doesn't need an audience, that true greatness is sometimes measured not by the light you seek, but by the darkness you're willing to bear alone so others can live in the light. Mickey O'Brien died believing he had failed. But his story, finally told, proves that some failures are actually the greatest successes of all. That some silences speak louder than any shout. And that some heroes are too great for their own time, only being discovered when the world is finally ready to understand what true heroism really means. This is Mickey O'Brien's story. The soldier who saved his battalion and then disappeared. The hero who chose anonymity. The ordinary man who did something extraordinary and spent the rest of his life trying to forget. Now you know why he chose to stay silent. And maybe, just maybe, you can understand why it was time to break that silence. Because heroes like Mickey O'Brien deserve to be remembered. Not because they wanted to be, but because we need them to be. If you like this story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are many other forgotten heroes waiting to have their stories told. And if you know any story like Mickey's, about ordinary people who did extraordinary things and never got recognition, leave it in the comments. Because every hero deserves to be remembered, even those who preferred to be forgotten.